joining IEC for our Lunch and Learn. Hopefully you've been on a few other ones, but again, we hope that these sessions are, helping everybody stay connected and also be informed during this uncertain and difficult time. A little bit of background information about IEC. We've been around since 1975, and we started off by a handful of grassroots environmental organizations that came together and really allocated our resources in a way that created a stronger voice on behalf of the environment in Illinois. And so fast forward to today, that mission is still the same, and a lot of our work is done through education and advocacy, including things like this webinar series. And while we're doing that, we're also representing 90 different environmental organizations, as well as 400 individual members throughout the state of Illinois. That being said, if you aren't a member of IEC, I highly encourage you to join. If not, I also encourage you to donate. That link is inside of the chat box. And if you are on the phone, it is ilenviro.org/donate. Really quick, a few household keeping items. Everybody on the phone is on mute. If you have a question or comments or want to provide resources, you can go ahead and put that inside of the chat box. If you're on the phone, just hold on until the end. We'll have a Q&A session where you can feel free to provide any questions or comments. And during that time, you can use *9 to raise your hand or *6 to unmute yourself. So before we get started, my name is Ayana Simba. I am the Clean Water Advocate at IEC, and my work oversees policy, advocacy, research, and community engagement around water issues. So I'm really excited today for this presentation about water affordability. We're going to have Josh Ellis and Dan Cooper from the Metropolitan Planning Council, and also Caroline Pakenham from Elevate Energy present about water affordability. So with that being said, I'll go ahead and pass it off to Josh.
Great. I'm going to share my screen. Sorry. All right. Can everybody see that?
Yep.
Okay. So thanks for having us on today, and thanks everyone for calling in. I think my primary job is to kill time while everyone calls in, and then Dan and Caroline are going to take over from there. But it's in the last couple of years, we have observed much more attention in the popular media, the Chicago Tribune, Cranes, a few other places, starting to cover issues of rising water rates here in Northeastern Illinois, and this is a trend that is consistent nationally. And while that is a good thing, oftentimes those stories can confuse a few issues. One, the costs of producing water are on the rise, but there are other costs that go into providing water here beyond labor and chemicals and pipes and things like that. In the Northeastern Illinois region, a lot of communities are buying water from one community or another, so there are these middleman costs that go into it. And there's not a lot of oversight over the cost side of water issues here in Illinois. So we're seeing water rates increase, but not really knowing totally why in every given community. And the reality is it's a slightly different story in every given community. But we know that we have effective ways of setting water rates that can account for affordability issues, so that even as your water rates are rising, you can create equitable rate structures that encourage conservation. There's a lot you can do with your rates, and our general hypothesis was that folks are not doing much with their rates. And as we've talked with folks around the region, water utilities, mayors, other folks who are setting these water rates, it became increasingly clear to us that even the definition of affordability was not commonly understood. The definition of what an equitable water rate was not commonly understood. And who are we really trying to set water rates for when we talk about equitable, affordable water rates? So prompted by some of those things and increasing questions that we were hearing or that we were having about the effect on people of those increasing water costs and the relationship between those costs and the rates, we undertook the study that Dan and Caroline are going to walk us through today. So our partners on this project, you can see them all listed here. I've just bolded the 3 people who are speaking about the work today, along with our social media handles. And we're going to walk through some work at Metropolitan Planning Council, the organization that Dan and I work for, Elevate Energy, which is where Caroline is, and then the Illinois-Indiana Sea Grant, which is the University of Illinois Extension Program. We undertook this work to try to understand how affordability was or was not being taken into account as utilities were setting their rates and setting rates to recoup their increasing costs. So there's a lot going on in this work, but we tried to boil it down to a handful of lessons that we can share today about what we believe is and isn't going on, and then some suggested remedies for how we can better account for water affordability in those rates. So really today we're going to talk about that research, the reality of these increasing rates and the lack of accounting for affordability in setting rates is resulting in a lot of people not being able to pay their bills, folks getting shut off, and we can talk a little bit about in the Q&A about the ramifications of all of that, particularly in this moment of COVID-19. But I would note that MPC and Elevate Energy and NRDC are doing another event in a couple of weeks where we're going to get more into the relationship between rates and shutoffs and reconnections, which I'll come back to at the end. So we're going to bounce around a little bit between Caroline and Dan, and then back to me at the end. But for right now, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Dan.
Thanks, Josh. I'm going to provide a little bit more background and context for the study before turning it over to Caroline to walk us through some of our results and how we're thinking, and then back to Josh to discuss how we're thinking about the policy applications that need to be put into place. So essentially, we look at this, there are two fundamental problems we're working with. One is that water rates are going up. So you can see, if you go back to that graph real quick.
Sorry.
It's all right. In 30 major cities in the last 10 years, water rates went up about 57%. That's even more so of an issue in northeastern Illinois, where those rates went up almost 80%. The problem is that incomes aren't keeping pace. So this growth is above and beyond how incomes are rising. So we know that for 75% of our communities in northeastern Illinois, that the water bills are rising above and beyond income growth. So there are reasons for that, right? We're in the replacement era of infrastructure. By some estimates, we're going to need to spend about $1 trillion across the U.S. Over the next 10 years just to maintain current level of drinking water service. So we know that there are major challenges with infrastructure. So there are reasons for water rates going up. But the problem is they're going up above and beyond incomes, and there are a lot of folks in different communities who are unable to pay for it, which is what leads us to our study. So next slide. So the major data we worked with was collected through the hard work of our colleague Margaret Schneemann at Illinois-Indiana Sea Grant, who over the last couple of years herself collected data from 215 communities across northeastern Illinois, meaning she made phone calls, she looked at websites to figure out water rates in different communities, right? So we're working with a data set where we know what average rates look like. So as you can see in the region, we've got a diversity of water sources, some from Lake Michigan, groundwater, et cetera. All this, points to what Josh mentioned earlier, that there is going to be no one-size-fits-all solution. There are different issues, different reasons for rates. We recognize that, but we wanted to dig in and really understand this challenge for low-income folks across the region. So the research objectives are to assess what today's best methodologies are for determining affordability. Hint, we don't think there are good methodologies, which is why we are doing this. And then do some analysis across the region to really understand where affordability is most concerned, and to jumpstart a regional dialogue about best practices. Because, the one thing we want people to take away from this is that, and our research will show this, affordability is a problem for just about every community, because every community is going to have places, neighborhoods, pockets where folks cannot afford basic water services. So we want to really see a shift from thinking about affordability as the average, or the average costs for the cost for the median household income, to thinking about the lowest income folks in a community. So real quickly, one thing we found when we jumped into this is there's no agreed upon or really sound way of defining and measuring affordability. The most common is the EPA's definition, which says water is affordable if somebody is paying 4.5% of their income for both drinking water and wastewater. So that just looks at the average consumer, the average household, and doesn't take into account the vast income inequality we have in the region, right? So this is something we know that is a problem. We've got some communities with extraordinarily high incomes, some with extraordinarily low, and places where there's a range of both, right? So income inequality is going to be a big driver of affordability challenges, and we wanted to determine a method that could really get at that in a more nuanced and robust way. So we thought of several different metrics using this 4.5% threshold, but applying it to low-income categories, which I'll turn it over to Caroline and let her talk a little bit more about this.
Great. Thanks so much, Dan, for setting that up. So what we wanted to do at this point is kind of walk you through the different methods that we employed with this study to really analyze and dig in and understand issues of water affordability in our region. So I'll go through those various methods, and then we'll present the results of our study for you. So if we want to go ahead and click to show you the first method that we use. So what we did is actually what Dan already mentioned. The first method that we looked at was this EPA affordability method. And here what we did is we looked at the percent of median household income that goes toward paying annual water and wastewater costs. And as Dan mentioned, if greater than 4.5% of a household's income is going toward paying that combined water and wastewater annual costs, then a water burden is deemed to exist. And for the communities we looked at in northeastern Illinois, what we did is we used those water rates from the Illinois-Indiana Sea Grant 2016 survey. And then we used an assumed consumption for households of 5,000 gallons per month. And then what we did is we divided by the MHI at the census tract level, and that gives you the water burden percentage. And again, the EPA method for analyzing water affordability, this has been criticized. I will say that this metric was never meant to analyze household water affordability, but it has been used. The other kind of criticism with using this methodology is that if you're only focusing on median household income, you're really masking and not seeing some of the affordability challenges that can be happening at lower earning income quintiles. So I just want to say we use this method, but it was more as a reference point for our study. And I think you'll understand that as we share the results a little bit later in future slides. And if we flip to the next method, so we kind of wanted to get beyond this median household income analysis to provide that clearer picture of water burden in our region. And so to do this, what we did is we looked at the percent of household income at the lowest earning income quintile, so not the MHI, that goes toward paying that combined water and wastewater bill. It was really important for us to move beyond MHI because it's helping us see what the water burden is for the most vulnerable customers and communities throughout our region. But again, if more than 4.5% of household income for the lowest earning income quintile is going toward paying annual water and wastewater costs, then a water burden exists. So that was the second kind of lens that we looked through for water affordability in our region. And now we'll talk about the third one. What we did next is we created this water affordability matrix, which Dan will provide a lot of detail on here in just a little bit. But this is helping us have a more nuanced view of water affordability. So what we did is we continued to look at the percent of household income for that lowest earning income quintile that's going toward paying the water bill. But then what we did is we crosswalked that with the percent of households earning below 80% area median income. And then we used those data points to kind of assign census tracts in Northeastern Illinois, kind of a score of 1 to 5. So a low water burden all the way up to a high water burden. Then next, what we did is we expanded kind of beyond this EPA method again. We actually looked at the number of hours someone in the lowest earning income quintile would need to work in order to pay their water bill on a monthly basis. And we adapted approach, Dr. Manny Teodoro out of Texas A&M came up with this approach, and we adapted it for our region. And it's just a really useful and illustrative way to think about water affordability in kind of a different context. And then finally, what our team did is we created this interactive online dashboard where you can actually go in, you can select your community, and you can view the results of our study, but we also paired it alongside socioeconomic data and other community characteristics, again, to create this more nuanced view of water affordability in our region. And so if we flip to the next slide, I do just want to touch on why it was important for us to kind of look through these different lenses to analyze water affordability. So it was really important for us to move beyond median household income. So we looked at not just MHI, but we looked at the lower earning income quintiles. Beyond using various income quintiles to kind of move the water affordability discussion forward, we also looked at smaller geographic units called census tracts. So we're not just looking at the community as a whole or at the city of Chicago, we're looking at the census tract level. Beyond using smaller geographic units, again, we're trying to express water burden in more intuitive terms. So that's why we kind of wove in that hours worked analysis. And then we created that online dashboard to pair other community characteristics with our analysis to create that more holistic view. So if we want to go ahead and flip to the next slide, at this point, we'll go ahead and begin to share some of the results of our study. So this first image that you're seeing on the slide here, this is showing you kind of that EPA affordability method that we looked at. And again, this is looking at the percent of median household income that's going toward paying annual water and wastewater costs. If it's greater than 4.5%, then a water burden exists. So we ran this throughout every single census tract in our region. And this is what we found. We found that only 4 municipalities in our entire region have one census tract that has a high water burden. So if we were only to use this approach, it's really giving us the appearance that our region isn't experiencing issues of water affordability. And so this is why it was kind of so important for us to move beyond this method of analysis. And so if we flip to the next image on this slide.
Sure, everyone should do a little bit of a drum roll in their head right now. This is like the aha moment of the whole thing.
Thank you for talking it up, Josh. Like one more click, yep. So this is when we move to looking at the lowest earning income quintiles. So with this, what we looked at is, annual household income in that lowest earning income quintile. So the bottom 20% of earners, what percentage is going toward paying the water bill. And what you see here, all the lights, kind of everything that's lighting up on that map, our census tracts were more than 4.5% of annual household income is going toward paying that water bill. So it's a very stark difference when you're looking at MHI versus the lowest earning income quintile. And as you can see in the image to the right on this slide, what we found is that a third of all census tracts in our region now meet that 4.5% threshold. And more than half of all municipalities in our region have at least one high water burden tract. So just looking at MHI, it's going to mask a lot of issues of affordability in our region. And then
Caroline, can we hang out on this map for a second? Because if we go back to, for those that read the Chicago Tribune series a couple of years ago, The Water Drain, it focused a lot on Maywood in the western suburbs and a lot on Fort Heights in the far southern suburbs. And Fort Heights has, I think, the highest water rates in the state and among the lowest incomes in the state. And Maywood isn't too far away. And there is that story that folks in those communities and many, many, many folks in those two communities are struggling to pay their bills. I don't think most people think about people in DuPage County or some of the more affluent suburbs of Lake County or even out into McHenry about them struggling to pay their water bills. But by using this methodology, we at least unearth the notion that, hey, you may have people in your community who are struggling to pay. You need to figure something out. And when we've showed this to water utility directors from DuPage and the western suburbs, you can see them stiffen up in their chairs a little bit to think, oh, have we left someone behind by the way that we're setting our rates? Are we setting people up for failure? And that's really the intent of the whole work, but starting to unpack the issues with that EPA methodology in particular, because folks who never thought, I mean, you've got Barrington area communities here where it's demonstrating that folks are struggling to pay their water bill. So.
Yeah, thank you, Josh. That's really an important point to drive home. And it also touches on not just, moving beyond MHI, but also getting down to that census tract level so you can get to see what Josh is talking about there. If we flip to the next slide, this is just kind of showing you again that difference between looking at lowest earning income quintile versus MHI. I'm not going to read through each row for you, but I think one of the rows that really hits it home for me is if you look at the number of high burden tracts, you see under the lowest income quintile threshold, that's 682 water burden tracts. And then if you look at the MHI, it's only 4. So it's a really stark difference. With that, I do want to pass it back over to Dan now to walk us through the water matrix burden analysis.
Yep, and this was just one other way we conceptualized for helping us think about and measure and understand water burden. So this matrix we came up with really gets at the problem I mentioned earlier about there being 2 reasons folks could be experiencing water burden. One is just because of extremely low incomes. And 2 is because of the cost of service or the cost of water being high, right? So those are on 2 different axes. And so we came up with a matrix to rank a census tract high if it, for either income reasons or for water pricing reasons, right? So when we do it this way, nearly 50% of our municipalities have at least one tract that's high burden for either income or price reasons. So you can just pause and look at this. It's spread across the region, the same as we showed on our previous maps. And when you think about the levels, so high burden is one category, but we also looked at medium high burden, meaning folks are either truly burdened because of cost or have extremely low incomes, or maybe one of those 2. So when you look at that, nearly 2/3 of municipalities have at least one census tract that's medium high or high. So I think this is yet another way for us to really tease out this, the sort of factors that can leave communities with folks who are unable to pay water bills.
And again here, just thinking about the geography, I think the easy story to tell is that the notion that communities are having to buy water from Chicago or Evanston or Hammond, Indiana is somehow driving up the cost here. But you're seeing these combined burden issues on this map and the previous one popping up in groundwater dependent areas of our region, like most of Will County is, Kendall, Kane County's Fox River water and groundwater for the most part, and McHenry's pretty much entirely groundwater. So it's not as simple a story as, because I have to buy water from a Lake Michigan coastline community, it's driving up my cost. There are other things going on here, the income issues that Dan's describing, plus other cost factors that are being borne by these utilities, whether that's chlorides in river water, radium and barium in groundwater, or just aging infrastructure and aging workforce in general. There are cost drivers that have nothing to do with buying water from a lakefront community that are part of the cost factor here.
And so one of the final ways that we looked at water affordability in our region is through an hours worked analysis. So here we're moving beyond that percent of annual income that goes toward paying the water bill. And instead, we're looking at the number of hours a household needs to work on a monthly basis in order to pay their water bill. Again, this was adapted from Dr. Manny Teodoro out of Texas A&M, but to conduct this analysis, what we did is we started with the annual income and the lowest earning income quintile. We did other income quintiles as well. We converted that to an hourly wage, and then from there you can figure out how many hours someone would need to work to afford their monthly water and wastewater costs. And this just really kind of drove it home for me. You know, what we found is that in 72 municipalities in our region, those folks in the lowest earning income quintile would need to work more than 8 hours a day to pay their water bill. So I thought that was a really powerful finding with this study. And you can explore this hours analysis if we flip to the next slide through the online dashboard that we created. So we created this interactive dashboard where you can go in, you can select your community to get this more nuanced view of water affordability. So in the dashboard, what you can do is you can see income, housing, transit, and water costs for each municipality. You're also seeing race, ethnicity, and the number of households in the community, also the number of owner-occupied and renter-occupied units. And then we also show, and this isn't something we've talked about yet, but we show the difference in income over the past 10 years in relation to water bill growth over the past decade. So that's a really interesting component of the online dashboard. And then as well, you also see that hours worked analysis for various income quintiles. So I would really encourage you to check out this online dashboard. You can view it at metroplanning.org/water dashboard. It's really enlightening. With that, I will turn it over to Josh to kind of wrap this up and talk about some potential solutions.
Yep. So part of the package here that we developed, in addition to this analysis, and a document that Dan showed earlier from the Illinois Indiana Sea Grant, looking at different definitions of water affordability. We did put out an additional document, which we can find online, about options for addressing this burden. Reducing costs is certainly one of them, but that is very challenging for water utilities right now because many of the infrastructure systems in our region have reached their usable life. The city of Chicago is replacing pipes that were installed when Theodore Roosevelt was president. Some of them are made of wood. I mean, the new equipment, the new costs cost something. So reducing costs is hard, but there are ways to do it. Certainly you can promote water conservation, and particularly our groundwater dependent communities in this region. Water conservation is an existential must because they're quickly running out of deep aquifer water. But it's the designing and implementing rates that we see as having the most promise. There are a lot of communities out there who have subsidies or reduced rates for seniors, although I'd note very few of them take the income of those seniors into account. And so there are some very affluent seniors paying lower water rates than less affluent younger people, simply because they're seniors. And there are a couple of communities with programs specifically geared for lower income individuals, but they're not common. And to our knowledge, no one in the region has something called an increasing block rate, which is that, say, the first 100 gallons of water consumed in a day are extremely cheap so that your basic needs are met. And then the next amount of water would be more expensive. And then by the time you're filling your pool or washing your Lexus, that water is quite expensive. There are a couple of communities, at least the last time I looked, that actually had the opposite. So the first water was the most expensive, and by the time you were watering your lawn, it was the least expensive. So there are ways to design rates to account for affordability and equity issues, but we don't see people using them extensively in our region. They are used more extensively in other parts of the country. That bleeds right into customer assistance programs. There's been a lot of talk amongst ourselves and other IEC members about creating low-income rate assistance programs throughout the state of Illinois. The city of Chicago just created a pilot program in the last year. We've talked a little bit about perhaps replicating home weatherization or energy efficiency assistance programs for water, and those are all in the mix as we talk about COVID-19 response. So these are all strategies, and then targeting the hard to reach. This is with all of these materials, whether it's water conservation or different payment streams, really getting out and understanding who it is in your community that is struggling to pay the most, and targeting them to understand what they need and how to work with them so that they get the water they need, but the utility is able to meet its costs. So there's more in this document about all of these. And it's really these kinds of strategies that we want to work with communities on. We're already, MPC and Elevate Energy, working with Evanston to take a look at their water rates. We've had some early conversations with Chicago and Aurora. So if we're able to move forward with all three of those, that's great. Those are 3 of the 10 biggest municipalities in Illinois. Not the point that I made and that Dan reinforced is that not every community can just do the same thing. If you are pumping groundwater and you have very high treatment costs plus older pipes, you simply cannot do the same things as a newer suburban community, perhaps 40 years old, who's on Lake Michigan water and buying it from a few towns over. Like, your water management system is different, and probably your population, their ability to pay is different, and then your mix of land uses is different too. And that's a big factor in many of our communities, is that particularly for Chicago and a lot of the south suburbs, the biggest water consumers used to be steel mills and other industrial actors. They are largely gone or are using less water, and so now residents are having to pay a higher burden on their bills. Point is, every community is different, and so again, the reports here speak to different actions that different communities, based on their typology, can take. There are some things that every community can do. If you simply have high water costs, there are things you can do. If you have an overarching low income issue, you're a little more constrained, but there are state or federal programs that could be of assistance. And again, the reports go into all of these. The whole report, everything that we've talked about today, is on our website at metroplanning.org/water affordability. There's also a link there to the dashboard tool that Caroline was just describing. And I would encourage folks to go there, to read up on it, and to have a conversation in your community with your elected officials about what your community and your utility's water situation actually is, and how water affordability is or is not being taken into account in your community. The answers will be very different, but until we start having those conversations on a utility by utility level, we're not going to make real progress again, because there's no silver bullet answers here. Quickly, before we move into the discussion, I hope folks have found this subject interesting, because MPC and Elevate Energy and the Natural Resources Defense Council are going to dig deeper into some of these issues in a series of webinars that we're going to kick off starting on May 5th. And you can see here the second one on water affordability in Northeastern Illinois. We'll talk in more detail then about the relationship between water affordability, shutoffs, and reconnections. But we have 3 events here coming up, and we'll send out information about all of those. Now I'm hoping that folks have questions. Before we get into them, I just want to say a few words about what we believe to be the case with water shutoffs and reconnections as related to this. So folks may remember that when Mayor Lightfoot here in Chicago came into office, she issued a moratorium on water shutoffs. And so in theory, since she became mayor, unless there's some repair need or something like that, folks should not have been having their water shut off. But there may have been folks who already had their water shut off in Chicago before she came in who still have their water shut off. So right now, in this moment of COVID-19, the city is trying to identify individuals whose water is still shut off, and then to determine whether the easiest pathway is to just provide them with water, whether that's bottled water or something else, or whether it's to reconnect and turn their water back on. If your water has been shut off for some time, not even that long, bacteria and other things can accumulate in it, particularly in Chicago, where we're conscious that we have more lead pipes than anyone else. Lead can have accumulated in that water if it's been shut off for a long time, so it's not quite as easy as just getting out a wrench and turning it back on. Statewide, we're trying to get a better picture of what's going on. The American Water Works Association did do a survey of utilities, I should say, in the last couple weeks. They had about 140 responses, which is, I think, 10% of all the water utilities in the state. I think it's safe to assume they probably got responses from higher capacity, more affluent communities, because that tends to be who responds to their surveys. But those communities all identified that they were not shutting off water during this time. The vast majority of them either had no disconnected accounts or were actively reconnecting people. I think there were only 3 communities that said they were not actively reconnecting people. But again, that sample may not be reflective of the rest of the state. And so we're endeavoring to figure that out. But there is a strong relationship here between the affordability issues that we're trying to unpack in this paper and then people's ability to pay, and then the ramification of getting shut off if they can't pay and they can't make up for their debt. And that's what we'll explore a little bit more on the event I just described. And we'll hear from NRDC about what's happening in other states grappling with the same issue like Michigan and Ohio. So with that, I'll stop. Happy to answer any questions about the work and hear from folks on the phone about their take on the same issues.
Yeah, I'll be reading off some of the questions in the chat. And then also, again, if you're on the phone, it's *9 to raise your hand and *6 to unmute yourself. But we have a question from Clark Bullard, and they asked, have you considered rate designs that eliminate the fixed charge in addition to a very, very low rate for a substance level?
Yeah, so that is a rate structure that we know to exist. Essentially, you have a very nominal fee for that basic. If I understand your question, all right, Clark, you have a very nominal charge for that first, say, 100 gallons of water or so a day, so that you can make your spaghetti and wash your kids' clothes and all the basics of life. And then as you consume more water above and beyond that, then you've got a variable charge to encourage conservation. I believe there's a couple of private water utilities in the state that actually have a rate that's similar to that. I don't know of any public utilities that do. It's entirely possible that they do. But I think the general point is with rate structures, you can do pretty much anything with them. The challenge is trying to generate enough revenue in total so that you can meet the costs of the system without disproportionately putting that burden on your lowest income or most vulnerable folks in your community. And that is hard, and it takes thought and it takes analysis, and we're not seeing enough of it done. But there's a ton of options for how you actually set your water rates.
But do you know of any actually eliminated the fixed charge, which down here in Champaign-Urbana is more than half of most people's water bill?
So your fixed charge is just regardless of how much you use, you have to pay a certain amount. Yeah. I think there are a lot of communities that do not have a fixed charge at all, and you're only paying based on your metered consumption, right? There are some that would say that the fixed charge, so long as you fix that charge fairly low so that everyone can pay it, is the best way for the utility to make a sufficient amount of revenue that it can operate. But if that charge is overly onerous for some folks or just doesn't make sense because it's whatever, yeah. There are folks who say that that's actually a good model to account for equity issues so long as the charge is set right. Okay. It may not induce conservation. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay.
I saw a question. Oh, go ahead. I was going to say I saw a question about regionalization.
Yeah, that was actually my question.
So sorry about that.
Regionalization, yeah. So regionalization is what people say when they don't want to say consolidation of water utilities. So I'm just going to say consolidation of water utilities because it's what it really means. Is it an option? We believe it's an option. And we would like to do more research on this to determine whether or not the handful of examples we have in northeastern Illinois or other places of consolidating water utilities has proven to lead to more affordable, equitable outcomes for lower income earners in those areas. The basic premise here is if you have a larger population with a more diverse income spread, then you have more options for how you set your water rates. for some of the communities that were featured in that Chicago Tribune series, their water rates are exceptionally high because of a whole range of cost factors, but their incomes are almost universally low throughout their residential population, and they have no meaningful industry or other users consuming water. And so you have very little in the way of options for how you set your rates to generate enough revenue for your costs. You can't have a water rate where lower income earners pay less and higher income earners pay more if everyone is lower income. So is regionalization or consolidation of utilities a way if you could consolidate some utilities that had lower earning populations with higher earning populations, residential land uses with commercial and industrial? It's an option. It needs to be studied more, and I couldn't sit here and tell you these 5 communities should consolidate and that would result in better outcomes, because we haven't done that level of analysis. That said, regionalization has gone really badly in some places because they just consolidated the utilities and then they averaged out the costs and they brought the rates down for the higher income earners and brought them up for the lower income earners to average it out across that geography. And that's not how we should be pursuing it here if it's something that we want to pursue. There's only a handful of drinking water regionalized services here in Northeastern Illinois, the Central Lake County Joint Action Water Agency, the Northwest Suburban Joint Action Water Agency, and we haven't done enough analysis there to figure out if the lower income earners in those communities are being somehow buffered from these costs because of the regionalization. I would note that we do have one very good example of this, and that's the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District, which takes property taxes from throughout Cook County and uses it to provide services. And because it's based on property taxes over such a large geography, you could make a very easy argument to say that lower income earners in Cook County are paying less relative to higher income earners for the same stormwater and sewer services. So.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd heard the term like regionalization, consolidation thrown around, and I was wondering like what that would look like in the context of water, but that was really helpful. Thank you. And then we have a question from Cheryl Watson. Has there been any consideration about changing the meter save program rate, since people with a meter are being charged more in general because they have to flush their lines more? This rate needs to be made more equitable. So I think, what Cheryl's referring to is the meter save program that's since been suspended because of issues with lead in drinking water, but it's with the idea that they advise meter safe people to flush their water lines more in order to clear out the lead. So is there a way that they're basically not being charged by because right now meter safe people are being charged by how much water they use, but they have to use more, that means that they're actually being charged more.
Yeah.
So she was asking, has there been consideration?
So if you don't have a meter, you're in the city of Chicago, and this is pretty much only a city of Chicago thing because pretty much every other water utility throughout the state is fully metered. Some of those meters are new and fancy, some are old and clunky, but at least they have meters and so they have a better understanding of how much water different properties are consuming. In the city, if you don't have a meter, it's just an assessment based on the size of your property and the age of your property, and you're just assessed the dollar amount per an assumed amount of water from that, regardless of whether you have one person living in the property or 10 or what have you. In a perfect world, when you install the water meter, the city would also replace your lead service line so that you wouldn't have this flushing issue. We're not currently do that. When the meter safe project started, they only put in the water meters. They didn't address the lead service line, and so you are seeing higher lead levels because the installation of the meter, just like any infrastructure project that shakes your pipes, shakes lead out of the pipes. If we actually had a program where we replaced the lead line and installed the meter, we could get to a point in the city of Chicago where, because you had meters everywhere, you could do a water rate based on income, or you could do increasing block rates so that the less you use, the less you're paying. We can't do that until we get to meters, and we can't get to meters until we replace the lead pipes. I'm not sure that's an answer to Cheryl's question, but like if we're going to make all of this work, it all needs to go together and not just be meters so that the water utility can pay its bills.
Thank you.
Can I respond?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
And that, because there's that gap there where they haven't replaced the lead lines, you do have people who are falling through the cracks, who are low wealth, who have higher water bills that are presenting a challenge, especially for seniors. And the city was going to have a program for seniors to help with their utility bills, but because of COVID, they've postponed it for now. So you do have another gap there where people are falling through the cracks and being impacted. So that might be something you want to, investigate to find out how much of a deficit that is.
Yep, I agree 100%. I mean, the idea with the meters is it was going to encourage conservation and bring people's bills down because they would see how much water they are actually using and be billed for it. But because folks are having to do this flushing or don't trust the water quality, we are seeing bills go up. Yeah, in some instances, not all. I shouldn't say we. I don't work for the water department, but yeah.
Yeah, but it's becoming a concern in the community conversation. So
Yeah.
We hope that somebody, can bring it to light.
Yep. We will do our best. I know Elevate will too.
We have another question from Delia Barajas. And she said, what do you consider reasonable low-income communities? She lives in Cicero, and she says our barrel of water includes water, sewage, and garbage. We pay $121 for 2 people.
I can take a stab at that, maybe. Hello, Delia. How are you? So I think, the goal of this was not to set rates for people or to say this is reasonable or this is not, but to really center low-income populations in the analysis. And so I think if I remember the data right, in Cicero, and when considering the lowest income folks in Cicero, they're definitely paying more than 4.5% of their income. So meaning by our analysis, low-income folks in Cicero are water burdened. So that's really the starting place for the analysis, is just considering the ability to pay for the lowest income folks. So definitely that lit up by our metric for Cicero. But as far as a specific rate, I think there's so much that goes into it. And I think Caroline and Josh probably have more to add about, considerations for setting rates. But Cicero definitely is in our analysis as having low-income folks who are burdened.
Dan or Caroline, that 4.5%, I know it comes from EPA, but even it itself as a measure has been critiqued. Can you say a little bit about what 4.5 does and doesn't mean?
Yeah, I mean, it's really just kind of an arbitrary number. Some have argued that percentage should be even higher. And then you hear a lot of water affordability experts say that cities on their own need to think about what they're comfortable with and what they feel is a good metric for their own community. So not just looking at that percentage, whether you pick 4.5% or a different percentage, but also, how many hours of work to pay the water bill are you comfortable with in your own community too? Maybe it's 10 hours, but it's really something that I think there should be community conversations on as well to really figure out what you consider to be reasonable as well.
Delia, can I ask, and you can type it in or we can unmute you, that number that you're saying 121, is that monthly, every other month, quarterly? I'm just curious. Every other month, great. One of the other things that I think in talking with water utilities about affordability, many of them, you could drive around the suburbs of Chicago and ask how frequently people get their water bills. There are communities where you get one a year. There are communities where you get it once a quarter, some where you get it every other month, some where you get it every month. And all of those have different ramifications for the water utility in how nimble they are able to respond to demand and things like that. But they have real ramifications for people's ability to pay. If you get a bill once or twice a year that you're not totally waiting for, and suddenly it shows up in your box and it's a few $100s. For a lot of households, that is a very bitter pill to swallow, and is what can lead to not being able to pay that particular bill. Some water utilities are hearing this and they're moving to more frequent billing, which is an administrative burden for the water utility, but it makes it easier for people to pay because you don't have to save up so much money, and it's not such a big check to sign or sign off on when it comes. But again, we have great inconsistency between communities on how frequently they're doing that billing. And that comes down to what is it that they're valuing. Are they trying to make it easy for people to pay? Or are they trying to make it administratively easier to handle by having fewer payment cycles every year?
And also, in addition, Josh, to the payment cycles, I agree, that's a really important thing to look at. There's also budget billing, which could help households. Yeah. Well, that's not available in every community. And sometimes even the water utilities billing systems don't enable them to do some of this. So you may have to have upgrades there, but budget billing is another tool which could also really help customers out.
Okay, we have another question. What states or cities have addressed water affordability well?
There's one city that a lot of people have been paying attention to, and that's the city of Philadelphia. So they implemented a tiered rate structure, I want to say a year or two ago. And what happens with that is what you're paying is basically based on your income. So that's one city that a lot of people are looking to see how that's going and to see if that's really helping out customers. But they're not just using that tiered rate structure alone that's based on income. They're also pairing it with things like water efficiency assistance as well. So the city of Baltimore also just is moving towards something like that as well. So that's something that I am following closely to see how that goes and how that may or may not be applied to other cities.
Yeah, and I can say also that I've looked at somewhat of a similar program that's in DC. Their SPLASH program is similar, where it's based on the area's income versus like the federal poverty level, which to me stood out because DC is actually a very expensive area to live in, so it made sense that they attached it to that. That's my 2 cents on that. Let's see, where's another? I think we have 2 more questions. Let's see. How did we get here? Has water affordability always been an issue? Did something change in the rate structure?
So it probably always has been an issue, but was one that I think has really peaked for a lot of folks in, say, the last 10 years for a couple of reasons. One, regardless of your source of water, the costs of providing water are going up as we expect and demand cleaner water. Cleaner water costs more, generally speaking. And as we have had to replace old pipes, as our original workforce in some of these communities has retired and is now being paid pensions, and we're paying salaries for folks that are replacing them, there's just a lot of reasons why the cost of providing clean water and treating wastewater are, generally speaking, increasing. But also in the last 10 years, we had a handful of instances in which artificially low water rates ended for one reason or another. One of those instances was actually in DuPage County. DuPage County for a long time was subsidizing water rates with sales tax dollars. And because they've got a lot of malls, this is sort of the promise of the suburbs, is low taxes, low costs, whatever. So they were keeping their water rates low, but subsidizing it with sales tax dollars. And in the recession of about 2008, the sales tax dollars dried up. And then even when we came back from the recession, Amazon killed off a lot of sales tax dollars. So they stopped subsidizing the rates. And suddenly everyone in DuPage County is paying the actual cost of water and not this subsidized cost. And that may be part of why DuPage County showed up in red on that map, is because folks haven't really adjusted to it. Then when Emanuel was elected for the first time in the city of Chicago, one of the main things that they did with water was to increase the water rates in order to accelerate the replacement of old infrastructure. City of Chicago has about 4,200 miles of drinking water pipes. And when Mayor Emanuel came into office, they were replacing on average 35 miles a year. And the pipes that they were replacing were between 100 and 120 years old. Well, you do the math. If you're replacing 35 miles a year in a 4,200 mile system, you are never going to catch up over a 100-year time frame for replacing these pipes. So they doubled the rate. They increased the rates to double the pipe replacement. The actual increase in rates in Chicago as a percentage was high, but as a total dollar amount was fairly low, only because the water rate in Chicago was already low. What happened was every suburb pretty much that buys water from Chicago used it as a politically advantageous moment where everyone was reading the press about Chicago raising its rates, and they raised their rates at the same time, often for much higher percentages and much higher dollar amounts. And because so many communities buy water from someone who buys it from someone else, who buys it from someone else, who buys it from someone else, who buys it from Chicago or Evanston or Waukegan or whatever, many communities, including Maywood and Fort Heights, end up paying the middleman costs associated with 2, 3, 4 transactions. And so in the last decade, water rates have just skyrocketed for a whole host of reasons. My guess is affordability was always an issue, but as water rates have jumped in the last 10 years without sufficient attention to affordability measures, so on and so forth, we've seen some huge increases in this region in particular, but I think we're seeing increasing water rates, generally speaking, throughout all of Illinois.
Thank you. This is our final question. I've noticed you looked at combined burden between water rate and sewage. Was one a bigger driver than the other, and does it differ dramatically by community?
I would honestly have to go back and look at our data sheet to do a comprehensive, look at whether one is more of a driver than the other. But what I will say is that since the study, we have started working more one-on-one with specific communities to use real billing data to conduct the same type of analysis. And I will say that in one of the communities that we're working with, the wastewater charges are certainly more of a driver and more of a cost in that particular community. So I certainly think that you do have community by community variation, but I would need to kind of go back and look at our data to give you a more comprehensive answer to that.
Yep, I'd echo that. You can follow up offline, and I'm happy to look into that and send out an email.
It's interesting because with wastewater, we do have a handful of very large wastewater utilities in the region, MWRD for Cook County, Lake County Sanitary District, Thorn Creek Sanitary District. Some municipalities will have a waste charge on their bills, but then we're also paying these underlying costs for those larger regional systems. We have a very different model for providing wastewater services in our region than we do drinking water services, which was not intentional at all. But.
Well, that was our final question, so we are at the end. Thank you, Dan, Caroline, and Josh, so much for presenting. It was a lot of information, but a lot of good information, and I definitely appreciate it. Thank you, everybody who's on the phone or is on Zoom. This week we'll be wrapping up our IEC Lunch and Learn series, unfortunately, but please join us tomorrow for our next one. That will be safe disposal of pharmaceuticals with James Jennings from the IPA and panel. Join us again until the rest of the week, and everybody enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all for joining us.